Ruby, Pam, and Jodi would get together and do these interventions. That's what they call them. And so they'd just go up and lock themselves in a room for 4 or 5 hours, and then they'd come out and they'd all just be on cloud nine, and Ruby would share with me like she had this amazing vision, and I wrote it and recorded it all down, and we have a work to do from God, and you're part of it, and the bishop's part of it, and we're all part of bringing all this stuff to the world.
So by this point, I'm sure many of you are aware or have seen the bucket load of police footage, body cam footage, interviews, phone calls, pictures of just the scenes, the behind the scenes of the Franke children being recovered from Jodi Hildebrandt's house, and also the arrest. We've had phone calls between Kevin and Ruby, and I believe Jodi has had a few phone calls released as well.
Reasons why we're here. So we'll explain after everything's done, after we clear the house and make sure everything's fine in there.
But why are you coming into my house without a search warrant?
We'll explain it after this.
But that doesn't make sense.
If any of you guys have seen or have come across the images of the children when they were found, the video footage, and then of course the absolutely devastating and horrendous photographs that were taken of their injuries and what they look like, just if you haven't already seen those images, just tread with caution, because as we were learning a lot about it, nothing prepares you for actually seeing it, and it definitely was worse than what I thought, and it's just horrible. It's not nice. Obviously, I'm not going to be showing it over here. I wanted to talk about, because I've seen a few videos now where people have been talking about the arrests and exactly what happened when Ruby was arrested and then Jodi was arrested. I wanted to talk more so on Kevin Franke's second police interview.
And I became the resident exorcist. That was the title I came up with myself. I thought it was kind of funny, but it was my job to like go and give her blessings whenever she started to like go into a trance and go into possession, and which started to be a lot.
The one thing that I did find extremely interesting, I mean, it's all been fascinating, but was Kevin Franke's second police interview, where he explains how Jodi was pretty much like possessed by, he doesn't say these words, but I will play you snippets of what he did say. He's basically describing like a paranormal entity, a supernatural being that Jodi was, Jodi's house was possessed kind of thing. And it is really strange listening to him talk about it so matter-of-factly. He's basically going into detail about, how he first met Jodi and the run-up to him being exiled from the house. But he does go into a lot of detail about, Jodi and Ruby's relationship and how at certain points Ruby literally just moved into the bed with Jodi. When Jodi lived in the house, Ruby suggested, because Jodi needed to be kept an eye on all the time because supposedly she was possessed, Ruby would just voluntarily go, well, I'm just going to sleep in the bed with Jodi now.
And Ruby would go up and check on her. It started like every 4 hours at night, and then it moved every 2 hours at night, and then it moved every hour at night, and then at some point Ruby said, you know what, I'm just going to start sleeping in there. And if I need you, I'll come down and get you. I'm like, that's kind of weird, but okay. And that was that. They started sleeping in the same bed.
Talk on Pam Bodger as well, who was basically the third member of the Connexions Foundation. She was listed as the director, I think. She had 2 of Ruby's other kids at the house at the time of their arrest, and everyone for the longest time was going, Pam, why is nothing being done about Pam? And Jodi Hildebrandt's niece Jessie, they even said, that's a bit strange that Pam isn't being investigated, because Pam was, Jodi's right-hand woman, so to speak. And Kevin did say that, you know, Pam is very much involved as well. Now, I know that all of, like, everything's already been done, trial's already been done, but I figured we had this new information, we have Kevin Frankie's, you know, police interview, so I figured we would just go through a little bit of it.
That's where Jodi really opened up to the women in a private conversation that she believed she was being tormented and haunted by shadow figures every night. And that was spooky, you know.
Now, what I will say is that there is a definite difference between how Kevin spoke about the space that Jodi and Ruby wanted him to get away from Ruby and the kids, and just about everything. There's a definitive difference between how he is talking about it in his very first interview before he's actually notified over what is happening. Kevin's just saying, you know, I took some space because I was working on my addictions. I had a porn addiction. And, you know, he was saying that Jodi's a wise, wonderful woman. I don't know. I can't, like, a very trustworthy woman. Was basically singing her graces. So these are a few little things that he did say.
Who's this female Jodi that your wife was? Do you know a female named Jodi?
She is a therapist and a life coach. Do I respect her? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think she is a very honest, truthful person. Yes.
Okay.
Ways that I treated my wife. And some of my own addictions that I was working through and seeking help on with pornography.
Thank you for sharing that.
And I've made some wonderful progress.
Like, is that something you came to the realization that you needed help and weren't doing things right, or is that something that, like, Jodi helped you guys recognize that maybe Ruby needed more? I'm trying to understand her involvement in your guys' life. She's my focus, so just to be honest.
I understand, and I can perceive that. Jodi and Ruby have a close relationship, and Jodi saw the need for me to get help, and frankly, I agree. The space has been exactly what I need to face, you know, my own addictions and receive the support and help that I've needed.
Whereas if you contrast that with how he then spoke about Jodi in his second interview, I think he brought in his lawyer, Randy Kester. You can go and watch these full interviews, by the way. I will leave them just linked in the description box. But you can go watch it. I think it's Hidden True Crime who has both of them.
But I can't describe to you what torture and hell it was to live an entire... It was more than a month, really, in complete isolation. Believing that I was, like, evil and, I mean, manipulative and lying and selfish, and that I had abandoned my family, and that I was more interested in my selfishness than my family.
I don't know. I think maybe there was a breaking point for him when he was then told exactly what has happened, and then he just sort of had a moment of realization. I know a lot of people are equally very upset with him. I do think that he does brush off the claims of neglect, you know, that his kids obviously went through during 8 Passengers, you know, Chad not even having a bed, having to sleep on a beanbag. At points in both of these interviews, Kevin does seem that he doesn't really see an issue with it.
So is this the one where they talked about like the beanbag?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they started going back and trying to dig and find, and then they find their little nuggets like, oh, look, Eve went to school without a lunch one day, or, you know, stuff like that. And, but it was the beanbag video that really set people off.
So then they went back from there.
Mm-hmm. So at that time, Ruby was really distraught.
But what I did find very interesting about when he was eventually told what has happened to his children, he was extremely concerned about Ruby. He was asking, you know, how is she going to be okay? How long? He just seems so preoccupied. But he then did back it up with, you know, I just want my kids. I just want to see my kids. But his very first thought after being told about what has happened to his children as a result of what his wife has done, the mum to these kids has done to them, wasn't to get angry at Ruby. It was to worry about her before worrying about his own kids.
What's going to happen to my wife? I love my wife.
I don't know. I'm being honest with you. I don't know. Haven't had an interview with
Are
you.
you going to press charges against my wife?
Possibly. I think given the circumstances, that's highly appropriate, but again, I don't know your wife. I was hoping to gain some insight from you, but I don't necessarily know that that's something you wanted to,
I trust her.
a road you wanted to travel down with me, so.
And not without legal representation.
Yeah.
Now, during the second police interview, Kevin does come back in with his attorney, Randy, and he goes into more detail about what Connexions was all about and how when he first joined, he thought that it was a bunch of man-hating women. And he didn't really see the point in it. He didn't understand it. He ended up being roped into actually being involved with it to the point where he was giving speeches. He was all up involved. I'm sure we've all seen that, you know, all the photographs of him wearing the little Connexions t-shirt. And this was around the point where Ruby felt like her whole entire world was crumbling down because their YouTube channel, basically everyone was attacking it. Jodi and Ruby managed to convince him by giving him, you know, speaking roles and him being involved with Connexions, that it would be a really good thing and it would like help their marriage. But from what he's saying, he didn't agree with Connexions in the very first place. Okay, he agreed with it after he was able to get involved and he was having the men coaching sessions, and it was okay for a little while. And supposedly the actual therapy was okay because Ruby was disclosing how she felt that he was too demanding and that she didn't like it when he would ask her to wear lingerie. It sounded like she didn't want to be sexual with him, but he wanted to be sexual with her, you know, as many couples do. So it just wasn't being reciprocated. And instead of Ruby and Kevin coming to some sort of a compromise, she basically told him that, you know, he couldn't have sex with her and he needs to stop being so demanding. I don't know.
I got challenged to sit down and have a vulnerable conversation with my wife and ask her how my lustful choices have affected her. And, you know, to me that was like a loaded question. I thought, I still didn't see what I had done or anything that would constitute any form of like, you know, abuse or anything like that. And but I did. I took the challenge and I sat down, and for 2 hours Ruby very emotionally just shared how she felt in our marriage and how the things that I over 20 years of marriage, you know, asking for sex as a husband frequently, or asking her to wear lingerie or things like that, how that made her feel. At that time, Ruby was really distraught, and she was looking for support. She was looking for someone who would understand her, who would validate her, and she found that in Jodi. All the stuff she did with Chad was because of Jodi, and so it makes sense that she would go to Jodi, you know, for emotional support when she felt like her world was burning down. In the meantime, like I felt like our marriage was getting stronger. It felt better. Like we didn't fight as much. Even though we were having less sex, it felt more connecting, and it was just, I thought, wow, this is great. Like, you know, this is great. And I was happy to be the guy up on the stage. You know, that started sometime in like late 2020 or the fall of 2020. There'd be a conference, and Ruby would say, I thought we were just attending it, but then she'd say, hey, they wanted us to get up and tell our story, you know, and I'm like, oh, okay, sure. And so I get up and just say, like, yeah, I was the guy who said, I think this is a bunch of, like, you know, man-hating, you know, women, but it really has made a difference in my marriage.
So it sounded like Kevin was getting a bit of attention. He was warming up to Connexions. He was being idolized almost within the community, within this little cult-like thing that Ruby and Jodi had been creating. And, you know, the marriage was supposedly getting a little bit better. But one of the things that does really stand out to me is that Kevin starts going on about paranormal heebie-jeebiness. He says that Jodi Hildebrandt went away to her friend's house, and they're known as the Hannahs, and she, according to Jodi, was kept there for 6 weeks. She couldn't leave, and you know, all of this stuff was happening to her. But then if you then ask the Hannahs, they say that she tried to seduce the husband, she would try and hurt herself, she would try and unalive herself, and they then had to ask her to leave. But the version of events are very different depending on who you ask.
This is where, like, I don't know what happened, but I do know that there's two different sides of stories. They tried to introduce her to a new cult lady that the Hannahs were getting into, so they wanted to merge their cults into one, apparently. And
They referred to it as a cult at the time?
oh no, no one in a cult says I'm in a cult. According to Jodi, she was held against her will for 6 weeks and was kidnapped, and she escaped. And to the Hannahs, after 6 weeks of Jodi stabbing herself with forks and knives, cutting herself, and wanting to commit and trying to seduce the husband of the family, they kicked her out. I don't know what's the truth. Maybe a little bit of both. I don't know.
And after this point, Jodi started to act really, really strange and was saying that she was seeing shadow people and that there were people in the walls and that she was being possessed by Satan, and lots of weird things were going on. And Kevin claimed that when they went over to Jodi's house, they would hear banging around the house, plates would go, you know, flying across the room. He saw it with his own eyes, and loads of creepy weirdness was going on in this house. Now, the thing is that I just don't put Kevin down as the kind of person to believe in that kind of stuff.
Jodi was back in her home in Ivans, and she was a hot mess. And she reached out to Ruby. But we were there, and she opened up and talked about, you know, her struggles and what was going on. And I gotta say, like, I'm a smart guy. I'm an engineer. I've designed and helped build some really big stuff. I've been a college professor. I can't explain some of the stuff that happened while we were there. Like crashes in the basement while we were talking upstairs, and plates like in the kitchen just flying off by themselves, like full speed, smashing on the wall and falling to the floor, like by themselves. I can't explain it, but I saw it with my own eyes, and I don't have any way to explain it other than there's some crazy shit going on. Her bishop at the time, a guy who's down there in Kayenta named Scott Galbraith. He's not our bishop anymore, but I mean, he was going over there like every night, and he'd be there for like 4 hours, and he'd be like, I'm fighting evil spirits, I'm casting demons out, I'm crazy stuff going on, and finally he got to the point where he's like, I can't do this anymore. Like, there needs to be some sort of resolution. At that point that they said, why don't you take her up to your house? And I was like, oh, hell no. but I was beaten over the head with it. Like, that's really insensitive. You know, she's done so much to help our family, and you're being selfish. The moment she showed up at my house, just the weirdest crap started happening. Lights turning on and off, sounds of people walking in walls, and like sounds like footprints going up walls and across the ceiling, and like stuff floating around, and it was weird, and I hated it.
Now, as well as this, just the whole thing just being utterly bonkers, Ruby was trying to plead with Kevin. This is before Kevin got kicked out of the house. Was trying to plead with him and say that Jodi needs to come and live with them. And Kevin was just not having it whatsoever. He was like, I do not want this craziness going on in my home, because he'd been round to Jodi's and it was like it was possessed. But she ended up getting her own way, and Jodi moved in the upstairs portion of their home. And that's when things started to get really weird at their house. Once again, I just find this incredibly hard to believe, but once again, this is what he said. So Kevin was claiming that he was basically the duty exorcist for Jodi during this time period, and she would have visions. And after this, you know, Ruby, Jodi and Pam would lock themselves in a room. By the way, this is Pam Bodger, the lady who everyone thought was a little bit suspect. They would all lock themselves in a room, and Jodi would have these visions. Honestly, the whole thing is just absolutely wild. Jodi's niece would say that Jodi used to tell her that she was sent from God to free the world of Satan, okay? This is what Jodi's niece would say. So it is entirely believable. I don't know if I believe this whole light flicking on and off paranormal heebie-jeebie mumbo-jumbo going on, but you never know. I mean, it is Jodi. She does have that kind of aura around her. Do you know what I mean?
And I became the resident exorcist. That was the title I came up with myself. I thought it was kind of funny, but it was my job to like go and give her blessings whenever she started to like go into a trance and go into possession, and which started to be a lot.
Further along the timeline is that Kevin eventually, he was actually living in the house and not even being able to speak to his own kids or Ruby. Like, things started getting stricter and stricter until it got to a point where he was asked to leave, and Ruby would just send him things to sign. At one point, he almost signed off selling their house until he actually read the agreement and he put his foot down. He signed off cars to her. At the very end of this interview, they do say that Ruby had drained the kids' bank accounts. I think it was around $80,000, and she just stashed it in the house. So Kevin was actually trying to get that money back.
When the warrant was issued, there was a bag with $85,000 cash in it. And I understand her lawyer, Ruby's lawyer, has all that. So here's kind of the issue. That money, she cleaned out their bank accounts.
The kids' savings account.
Yes, and yours too, your joint account.
Yeah.
And that's where that money came from.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you can have, or if I need to have a discussion with the county attorney. Kevin would kind of like his kids' money back.
I mean, this does not surprise me one little bit. And what makes it really quite interesting is that, do we remember, it was ages ago, it was right around the time that they were arrested, there was this cellmate who got out, this is what she was alleging, that she overheard Ruby Franke on the phone to her husband, and she was saying, can you please go into the house and get me my money for a lawyer? So maybe this person was right, because this is the very first time I'm hearing about this once again, where they're saying, you know, there was money found in the house. But yeah, Ruby had just been draining the shared account, and she'd been draining the kids' bank account. But what is really interesting is that Kevin's role in everything wasn't to see his kids, wasn't to see Ruby, the kids, nobody, absolutely nothing, but just to give money to Ruby.
This is a witch hunt. The devil been after me for years.
There is much more to those police interviews because I think they're about 40 minutes long. At least I know the second one is. So I will leave them linked in the description box. I just wanted to flag up some things that I hadn't really heard before. The very first time I'm hearing the fact that Kevin thought that there was like paranormal activity going on within the home. You know, we all knew that Jodi, she was trying to rid the world of Satan. We've heard this before. But it's just pieces to the puzzle that I haven't quite yet heard. In regards to the run-up of the event, I do know that there are quite a fair few people that have done their own commentary and their own takes and shared more on the situation. I know Law and Crime Network have been covering this extensively, so go over there and watch anything, but I would tread with caution looking at documents and looking at photographs, because like I say, extremely sensitive imagery, and it's just shocking. It's just deplorable. It's horrible. There's nothing more to say in how to describe a situation, but yeah, just tread carefully. So yeah, I hope you guys have a wonderful day wherever you are in this world. Take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and I will catch up with you guys in the next video.